In the winter of 1531, a pot of porridge would become an instrument of death, a simple meal that would forever change the way England viewed culinary treachery. Richard Roose, a cook in the household of Bishop John Fisher, stood at the center of a crime that would shock the nation and draw the personal attention of King Henry VIII himself. Imagine a kitchen in Rochester, steam rising from bubbling pots, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the quiet concentration of servants preparing a meal. On this ordinary day, something extraordinary and terrifying was about to unfold. A moment that would transform a routine act of cooking into an alleged weapon of murder. The Bishop of Rochester was a man of significant influence, a close advisor to the royal court and a respected religious leader. His household was not just a home, but a center of political and intellectual activity. Richard Roose, as the cook, occupied a position of extraordinary trust. He prepared food that would pass through the hands of powerful men, food that could mean the difference between life and death in an era where poison was a feared weapon of political intrigue. What happened that day was more than a simple culinary mistake. Some said it was deliberate poisoning, others claimed it was a terrible accident. But in the brutal calculus of Tudor England, the intention mattered less than the result. 2 men would die, the bishop's household steward and a poor servant, and suspicion would fall squarely on Richard Roose. This was not just a criminal case. This was a moment that would reveal the raw, terrifying part of King Henry VIII. A monarch increasingly willing to demonstrate his absolute authority through acts of shocking public violence. Rose's fate would become a warning, a gruesome spectacle designed to terrorize an entire population. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment and care, had become a potential crime scene. Every stirring of a pot, every sprinkle of powder, every seemingly innocent ingredient could now be viewed with suspicion. In a world where trust was as fragile as glass, Rose's alleged crime would shatter those delicate social bonds. Henry VIII was transforming England. The old medieval world was crumbling, and a new order was emerging, one where the king's will was absolute, where punishment could be swift, public, and unimaginably cruel. Richard Roose would become a symbol of this transformation, a human sacrifice to the king's growing power and paranoia. No one could have predicted that a simple pot of porridge would lead to an execution method so horrific that it would send tremors of fear through every kitchen, every household, every corner of the realm. The story of Richard Roose was about to become a dark legend, a tale of cooking, conspiracy, and a punishment so extreme it would challenge the very boundaries of human cruelty. In the shadow of Rochester Castle, in the kitchens where steam and suspicion mingled, a story was unfolding that would change England forever. And at its center stood Richard Roose, a cook about to become something more, a warning, a victim, a symbol of an age where a single mistake could cost you everything. In the quiet kitchen of Bishop John Fisher's household, a moment of routine preparation would transform into a catalyst for one of the most terrifying legal precedents in Tudor England. Richard Roose, the cook, stood before the bubbling pot of porridge, his hands moving with the practiced rhythm of a professional. He was no stranger to these kitchens, a man who had built his reputation on serving the wealthy and powerful of Rochester. But something went wrong that February morning in 1531. When the porridge was served, disaster followed swiftly. The bishop's household was thrown into chaos. John Fisher's stepfather died, and the bishop himself became violently ill. Rumors began to spread like poison through the narrow streets and corridors of power, whispers of deliberate contamination, of murder most foul. Rose's defense was simple. He claimed it was an accident. He had purchased some powders from an apothecary, believing them to be harmless seasoning. The difference between a culinary mistake and an intentional act hung in the delicate balance of Tudor justice, a system increasingly defined by the capricious will of King Henry VIII. The legal proceedings that followed were anything but straightforward. Roose was a cook in a bishop's household, a position of significant trust. To poison those who employed you was more than a simple crime. It was a fundamental betrayal of the social order that held Tudor society together. The whispers grew louder. Was this an act of malice, a political statement, or a terrible, tragic mistake? Witnesses testified about the horrific consequences. The bishop's stepfather had died in agony, and Fisher himself had survived only through what many considered divine intervention. In a world where food preparation was a deeply personal act of service, such an incident struck at the very heart of social trust. The legal machinery of Tudor England began to grind into motion. This was not merely a local matter, but one that would attract the attention of the most powerful man in the kingdom. King Henry VIII saw in this case an opportunity to send a message about the sanctity of domestic service and the protection of those in power. Roose found himself caught in a nightmare beyond his comprehension. The accusations against him were devastating, not just of accidental poisoning, but of deliberate, calculated murder. In the Tudor imagination, such an act was tantamount to a direct assault on the social hierarchy itself. What made this case particularly chilling was its ambiguity. Was Roose truly a murderer, or a man who had made a terrible, fatal mistake? The line between intention and accident was razor-thin. And in the brutal calculus of Tudor justice, such nuances mattered little. As the case moved through the legal system, it became clear that Roose was fighting more than a simple criminal charge. He was fighting against a growing desire in the royal court to make an example, to demonstrate the absolute power of the monarch over life and death. Little did Richard Roose know that his case would become a turning point, not just in his own life, but in the very fabric of English legal history. The wheels of justice were turning, and they would crush him with a brutality that would shock generations to come. In the winter of 1531, England trembled beneath the mercurial reign of Henry VIII, a monarch whose political landscape was as volatile and dangerous as his own unpredictable temperament. The kingdom was not merely a realm of governance, but a delicate ecosystem of power, where a single whispered accusation could transform a life from privilege to peril in moments. Henry's court was a powder keg of competing ambitions, religious tensions, and personal vendettas. The break from Rome was still fresh, a raw political wound that had transformed England's fundamental relationship with power. Every act of governance became a statement, every punishment a message. Richard Roose's alleged poisoning would become more than a simple criminal act. It would be weaponized as a demonstration of royal authority. The Catholic Church's traditional judicial mechanisms were being systematically dismantled, replaced by royal decree and personal interpretation of justice. Henry was not merely a king, but a revolutionary, rewriting centuries legal and religious tradition to consolidate his own power. In this environment, crime was never just crime. It was political theater, with the monarch as both director and lead performer. Poisoning carried a particular horror in Tudor England. It was seen not merely as murder, but as a betrayal of fundamental social contracts. To poison someone was to attack not just an individual, but the entire hierarchical structure that maintained societal order. For a servant to potentially poison a bishop, a representative of both spiritual and temporal authority, was tantamount to an attack on civilization itself. The political subtext was clear. Henry needed to demonstrate absolute control. With the Catholic Church's authority crumbling and European monarchs watching his every move, he could not appear weak. Roose would become a symbolic sacrifice, a public warning about the consequences of challenging established power structures. Moreover, this was a moment of profound social transformation. The old feudal relationships were dissolving, replaced by a more centralized, ruthless form of governance. Servants were no longer just employees, but potential agents of chaos. Their actions could be interpreted as deliberate political statements, their punishments a form of state communication. Henry's advisors, men like Thomas Cromwell, understood the power of spectacle. A public execution was not just punishment, but a sophisticated form of political communication. By creating a punishment so grotesque it would be remembered for generations, they would inscribe a message of terror into the collective social consciousness. The religious reformation happening simultaneously added another layer of complexity. As traditional spiritual authorities were being dismantled, new forms of social control were emerging. The state was becoming the ultimate arbiter of morality, with the king as its supreme judge. Rose's execution would be a demonstration of this new paradigm, where royal power superseded all previous legal and moral frameworks. In this charged atmosphere, Richard Roose was less an individual than a symbol, a convenient narrative through which Henry could communicate his absolute authority. His fate would be determined not by the specifics of his alleged crime, but by the broader political calculus of a kingdom in radical transformation. The cauldron was being prepared, not just a method of execution, but a canvas upon which the new political order would paint its most terrifying message. In the shadow of Richard Rose's alleged crime, something unprecedented was stirring in the chambers of English law. Parliament, at King Henry VIII's direct urging, began crafting legislation that would transform punishment from judicial process to public spectacle. The Poisoning Act of 1531 wasn't merely a legal document, it was a calculated instrument of terror. Before this moment, poisoning was typically treated as a form of murder, prosecuted through standard criminal channels. But Henry VIII saw an opportunity to make a profound statement about royal power and social control. The new law would do more than punish a crime. It would send a visceral message about the consequences of threatening the established order. Under this law, poisoning would be classified as petty treason, a category previously reserved for servants who murdered their masters or subjects who attempted to kill the monarch. By elevating poisoning to this status, Henry transformed what might have been a private crime into a direct challenge to social hierarchy. The punishment would no longer be a simple execution, but a carefully choreographed demonstration of state power. The legal language was precise and chilling. Anyone convicted of intentionally poisoning another would be boiled to death in water or scalding liquor. These weren't just words. They were a promise of a death so horrific that it would haunt the imagination of every person who heard about it. Public executions were common, but this was something altogether different. A form of punishment designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. Legal scholars of the time understood the profound psychological impact. This wasn't just about Richard Roose or preventing future poisonings. It was about creating a spectacle so grotesque that the mere thought would deter even considering such an act. The law turned execution into a form of state-sanctioned theater, where pain became a messaging system. What made this law particularly insidious was its deliberate public nature. Executions were always social events, but boiling promised a level of visceral horror that went beyond traditional methods. Imagine the marketplace, filled with people watching a human being slowly cooked alive, the screams, the steam, the absolute finality of such a punishment. Interestingly, the law applied to a surprisingly narrow range of circumstances. It specifically targeted intentional poisoning, not accidental contamination. This precision suggested that Henry understood the law needed to be more than just a blunt instrument. It needed to appear somewhat rational, even as it remained fundamentally terrifying. The legal language revealed something deeper about Tudor society. A growing obsession with controlling bodies, with making punishment not just a method of justice, but a form of communication. Every execution was a message, every punishment a statement about power, social order, and the consequences of challenging authority. Richard Roose would become the first and most famous victim of this new legal framework, a cook transformed into a symbol of what happens when one steps outside prescribed social boundaries. His body would become a text, written in pain, read by an entire kingdom. In the end, the Poisoning Act of 1531 was more than legislation. It was a declaration about royal power, about social control, and about the terrifying lengths to which the state would go to maintain its authority. A law written in water and fire, promising that those who threatened the established order would pay the ultimate price. In the heart of London, a massive copper cauldron looms, its dark metal gleaming with an ominous promise. Steam rises in thick, heavy clouds, the water roiling and churning with a terrible, inexorable heat. Richard Roose stands nearby, his body trembling not from cold, but from the raw, animal understanding of what awaits him. The year is 1531, and Henry VIII has decreed a punishment so horrific that it will become a landmark moment in Tudor justice. Roose, once a cook in the household of Bishop John Fisher, is about to become the first and perhaps only person in English history to be executed by being boiled alive. Around him, a crowd has gathered. Not the theatrical, bloodthirsty mob of popular imagination, but a mix of terrified and fascinated witnesses. Merchants, laborers, children, and nobles alike stand in uneasy silence. This is not entertainment, but a stark warning carved into human flesh. The crime that brought Roose to this moment was seemingly simple. He was accused of poisoning a pot of porridge that sickened the bishop's household. 2 people had died, the bishop's stepmother and a servant child. Whether it was intentional murder or a terrible accident would become almost irrelevant in the face of this punishment. Witnesses would later describe the execution with a clinical detachment that barely masked their horror. Roose was not simply dropped into the boiling water, but slowly lowered, inch by agonizing inch. The water, heated to near boiling point, would have caused immediate, catastrophic damage to his skin and underlying tissues. Imagine flesh separating from bone, nerve endings screaming with a pain beyond human comprehension. Medical historians today suggest that death would have been relatively quick, perhaps within minutes, but those minutes would have been an eternity of unimaginable suffering. The human body, when subjected to such extreme heat, cannot maintain its structural integrity. Skin bubbles and separates, fat liquefies, muscles contract and then dissolve. This was not just an execution, it was a deliberate act of political theater, a message written in human suffering. Henry VIII was sending a clear signal about the consequences of threatening the sanctity of a household, particularly one belonging to a powerful church official. The punishment was so extraordinary that a new law, the Acte for Poisoning, was quickly passed, making death by boiling a legal method of execution for poisoners. The crowd would have been united in a collective horror, part fascination, part revulsion. This was not a clean execution like beheading, but a prolonged, visceral demonstration of royal power. Each moment Roose spent in that cauldron was a warning to others. Cross the king, threaten his people, and you will suffer beyond imagination. By the time Richard Roose's body was removed, a grotesque, unrecognizable mass, the message was clear. In Tudor England, the line between accident and murder was razor thin, and the consequences of crossing that line could be beyond human endurance. This was not just a death. This was a statement. This was power made manifest in the most brutal way possible. The marketplace buzzed with a strange mixture of horror and fascination. People whispered, their voices carrying a tremor of fear that spoke louder than any public proclamation. Richard Roose's execution was more than just a punishment. It was a theatrical warning, a brutal message etched into the collective consciousness of Tudor England. In the days following the boiling, conversations rippled through taverns and marketplaces. Some people saw it as divine justice, a righteous punishment for a crime against a man of the church. Others felt a deeper, more visceral unease. This wasn't just an execution. This was a spectacle of state power that transformed human suffering into a public performance. The common people understood the underlying message. This wasn't simply about punishing Richard Roose. This was about demonstrating the absolute power of King Henry VIII. Each drop of boiling water became a statement. Challenge the established order, and your body would become a canvas for royal vengeance. Mothers would later tell their children stories of the cook's fate, not as a simple cautionary tale, but as a real warning. "Remember Richard Roose," they would whisper, "and know that the king's mercy is as temporary as morning mist." The execution transformed an individual tragedy into a collective trauma, a shared memory that would echo through generations. The clergy, who often supported such punishments, saw this as a moment of divine retribution. Bishop John Stokesley, whose household had been the target of the alleged poisoning, likely viewed the execution as a confirmation of God's justice working through the king's hand. Religious sermons would later use Roose's fate as a moral lesson about the consequences of betrayal and wickedness. Yet beneath the public display of acceptance, private conversations told a more nuanced story. Some questioned the proportionality of the punishment. A cook, potentially confused or accidentally negligent, was being subjected to a death so horrific it defied human comprehension. The line between justice and barbarism seemed frighteningly thin. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed Roose was a victim of court intrigue. Others saw him as an example of rising anxieties about food safety and potential assassination attempts. In a world where poison was a constant fear, his execution represented more than just punishment. It was a complex performance of power, fear, and social control. The most chilling aspect was how quickly such brutality could become normalized. Within weeks, the initial shock would fade, replaced by a grim acceptance. This was the true horror, not just the physical torture, but society's capacity to absorb and internalize such violence. For the poor and vulnerable, Roose's execution was a stark reminder of their precarious existence. In Tudor England, one mistake, one misunderstanding, could transform an ordinary person into a grotesque spectacle. The boiling didn't just kill a man, it sent a message that would resonate through the social fabric, a warning written in scalding water and human suffering. Years later, when people spoke of Richard Roose, it would not be with sympathy or detailed remembrance, but with a hushed tone that suggested something beyond mere execution, a moment when human cruelty had been transformed into state policy, when a cooking accident could become a performance of absolute power. Richard Roose's execution marked more than just a gruesome punishment. It represented a chilling transformation in legal brutality and state power. His boiling became a deliberate spectacle, engineered to terrorize not just potential poisoners, but anyone who might challenge the emerging absolute monarchy of Henry VIII. The new law passed in 1531 wasn't merely a legal technicality. It was a psychological weapon, designed to penetrate the public consciousness with visceral fear. By creating a punishment so extraordinarily painful, Henry VIII was sending a message that transcended the specific crime. Challenge royal authority, and the consequences would be unimaginably horrific. Historians today understand this moment as a critical pivot in English legal history. Before Roose, execution methods followed established precedents. Now, the state was demonstrating its capacity to invent entirely new forms of punishment, to literally rewrite the rules of human suffering. The boiling statute represented something more profound than criminal justice. It was a declaration of sovereign power's total dominion over human bodies. The public nature of Roose's execution was intentional. Crowds would watch, then disperse, carrying whispered stories of what happens to those who transgress royal will. Each retelling would reconstruct the terror, multiplying the psychological impact far beyond the single moment of execution. Fear became a form of governance. Yet beneath the brutality, there was a deeper societal shift happening. Medieval justice was transitioning from community-based resolution to centralized state control. Roose's punishment wasn't just about him. It was about establishing who truly held power in this rapidly changing world. Crucially, the punishment revealed more about the perpetrators than the victim. In creating such an elaborate, public spectacle of suffering, Henry VIII and his advisors exposed their own psychological landscape. A world where demonstrating power mattered more than proportional justice. The legacy of this moment echoes through centuries of legal and political development. It represents an early example of how state power can weaponize public fear, how legal systems can be manipulated to serve political narratives. Roose became less a person and more a symbol, a warning etched in collective memory about the potential cruelty of unchecked authority. Modern scholars see this not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader pattern of Tudor governance. Public executions were theatrical performances of power, carefully choreographed to communicate complex political messages. Roose's boiling was a particularly extreme manifestation of this approach. More than 500 years later, we can trace direct lines between this moment and subsequent developments in legal philosophy, human rights, and concepts of state power. The very revulsion we feel serves as a reminder. Civilizations are defined not just by their achievements, but by how they treat their most vulnerable members. In the end, Richard Roose's real legacy isn't the manner of his death, but what his death revealed about human nature. Our capacity for systemic cruelty, but also our eventual ability to recognize and reject such brutality. His execution stands as a stark warning. Power untempered by compassion is the most dangerous poison